The courtroom went silent the moment Judge Harrington lifted his gavel. Not the polite silence of an orderly proceeding, the kind that settles into a room when something has gone wrong, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. At the defense table, Yvonne Kessler sat alone. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her with a stillness that looked practiced. Anyone watching from the gallery might have mistaken it for composure. But her knuckles had gone white at the joints, and her eyes, dark, careful eyes that had once commanded boardrooms across 3 provinces, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, somewhere no one else in that room could see. Her lawyers were gone, all 4 of them. The lead counsel, a man named Hargrove who had billed her $900 an hour for 14 months, had called her at 7:46 that morning to inform her that his firm was withdrawing from the case, effective immediately. He offered no explanation beyond a conflict of interest that has only recently come to light. When she pressed him, the line went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm sorry, Yvonne," in a tone that didn't sound sorry at all. It sounded like a man reading from a script someone else had written for him. The trials was scheduled to begin at 9. What nobody in that gallery understood, what the journalists furiously typing into their phones did not yet know, was that the most important person in the room that morning was not the judge, and was not Yvonne Kessler, and was not the team of corporate attorneys arranged in expensive suits on the prosecution side. It was the man in the gray coveralls pushing a mop across the marble floor near the back entrance who had stopped moving the moment he heard her name called. His name was Walter Pruitt. He was 58 years old. He had a bad knee that ached in cold weather, which in Ottawa meant it ached roughly 9 months out of 12. He drove a 2009 Dodge pickup with a crack in the passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to fix. He lived in a 2-bedroom unit in Vanier with his daughter Lily, who was 16 and was currently going through a phase of wearing enormous headphones and speaking to him mostly in shrugs. He had been a custodian at the Elgin Street Courthouse for 11 years. Before that, he had been a lawyer. Not just any kind of lawyer. Walter Pruitt had spent nearly 2 decades as one of the most respected forensic litigation specialists in Ontario, the kind of lawyer other lawyers called when a case involved financial documents so complex they looked like abstract art, when corporate structures were nested inside one another like Russian dolls designed specifically to hide wrongdoing. He had a gift for finding the thing that was not supposed to be found. He had, over a career that spanned from 1988 to 2009, won cases that most of his colleagues had quietly written off as unwinnable, and then his wife, Maureen, had died. She had been 44 years old. She had been a school librarian who grew tomatoes on their back porch every summer and laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and had loved him, he always believed, more than he deserved. She had died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday in October, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon in the parking lot of a grocery store on Bank Street. Walter had taken 6 months of compassionate leave, and then he had simply not gone back. He returned his clients' files to their respective firms. He let his Law Society membership lapse. He did not respond to the letters that came from colleagues asking if he was all right. He was not all right. What he was for a long time was very quiet. The courthouse custodial position had come to him through a neighbor whose cousin worked in facilities management. He had taken it without any particular reason, beyond the fact that it gave him somewhere to be in the mornings, and the building was familiar, and the work required just enough concentration to keep his mind from going to certain dark places, but not so much that he had to be fully present in the world. He had been pushing that mop for 11 years. He recognized Yvonne Kessler the moment she walked into the courtroom, though they had never met. He had followed her company's legal battles in the news the way he used to follow certain hockey teams. Not with investment, exactly, but with professional appreciation for the strategy involved. Kessler Biotzinsynth had developed a carbon capture system that, by every independent assessment, was a genuine breakthrough. It could retrofit existing industrial facilities at a fraction of the cost of previous methods and reduce emissions output by up to 70% within 3 years of installation. The technology stood to make Kessler Biosynth extraordinarily valuable. It also stood to make several much larger companies extraordinarily uncomfortable. Aldercroft Energy Group had been the most uncomfortable of all. They had spent the better part of 2 years attempting to acquire Kessler Biosynth, through means that grew progressively less polite, and when Yvonne had declined their final offer, publicly, at an industry conference, in terms that were measured but unmistakable, they had shifted strategies entirely. The fraud charges had appeared 4 months later. Walter had read about the charges the way he read about most things these days, with a certain distance, the way you watch weather through a window. He had noted that the evidence seemed thin. He had noted that the timing seemed convenient. He had set down his coffee and gone to work. He had not expected to be standing at the back of the courtroom, mop in hand, watching Yvonne Kessler discover that she was entirely alone. But here he was, and here she was, and the judge was asking, with the careful neutrality of a man who has seen many things in many courtrooms but finds this particular situation genuinely unusual, whether the defendant intended to proceed. Yvonne stood up. Her voice when she spoke was steadier than it had any right to be. "I'm requesting a continuance, Your Honor. My legal representation has withdrawn this morning without explanation." The prosecution objected immediately. The lead attorney, a man named Forsyth who had the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had never lost sleep over anything, argued that the withdrawal was the defendant's own responsibility and that further delays were prejudicial to his clients. The judge was deliberating when Walter set down his mop. He walked to the front of the courtroom with the unhurried pace of a man who had long since stopped worrying about how he appeared to others. He was aware of the looks he was attracting, the gallery murmuring, a bailiff tensing slightly, Forsyth glancing over with something between contempt and curiosity. He stopped at the bar. "Your Honor," he said, "my name is Walter Pruitt. I'm a member in good standing of the Law Society of Ontario." He had reinstated his membership 3 weeks ago. He hadn't told anyone. He had done it at 2 in the morning, online, because he hadn't been able to sleep, and he had been sitting at the kitchen table thinking about Yvonne Kessler's case and thinking about the document he'd read on his phone that afternoon, a financial disclosure that had what looked very much like a fabricated audit trail buried in Appendix C, and he had thought, with a clarity that surprised him, "I still know how to do this." He had paid the reinstatement fee and closed his laptop and gone to bed and not thought about it again until this moment. The courtroom was very quiet. "I'm requesting to be admitted as defense counsel for Miss Kessler," he said, effective immediately, "and I'm requesting a continuance of 72 hours to review the case materials." The judge looked at him for a long moment. "You're the custodian," he said. "I am," Walter said. "I'm also a litigator with 20 years of experience in forensic financial law. I can provide documentation of my credentials to the court." Forsyth was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is irregular in the extreme." "Many things are irregular this morning," the judge said, in a tone that suggested the irregularity was not limited to Walter's appearance. Yvonne had turned in her chair. She was looking at him with an expression he would think about afterward. Not relief, not exactly, but something more complicated than that. The expression of someone who had been bracing for impact and is trying to determine if what they're feeling is the crash or the absence of one. "Miss Kessler," the judge said, "do you consent to this representation?" Yvonne looked at Walter. Walter looked back at her with the steady, unhurried calm of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. "Yes," she said, "I do." The judge granted 48 hours. Walter spent the first 36 of them in the courthouse law library and at his kitchen table, surrounded by the printed case files that Yvonne's former legal team had, to their credit, transferred promptly and completely. Lily came home from school on the first evening, took one look at the paper covering every horizontal surface, and wordlessly made him a sandwich, which she left beside his elbow without comment. He ate it without looking up. The charges against Yvonne were, on the surface, carefully constructed. They alleged that Kessler Biosynth had misrepresented its revenue projections to investors during a funding round 3 years earlier, inflating the value of a subsidiary called Meridian Cleantech by approximately $34 million. There was a paper trail, there were emails, there were signed documents. What there was not, Walter noted at approximately 2:45 in the morning on the second night, was any record of who had created the Meridian Cleantech subsidiary in the first place. He set down his pen. The subsidiary had been incorporated in Alberta 18 months before the funding round in question. The filing agent was a numbered company. The numbered company traced back to a law firm in Calgary that had dissolved in 2021. The law firm's principals, when he found them through a legal directory, included a name he recognized. A man named Tilson, who had spent 15 years as general counsel for Aldercroft Energy Group before opening a private practice. Walter sat for a long time in his kitchen, which was quiet except for the furnace cycling on and the distant sound of Lily's music through her closed door. Then he opened his laptop and kept going. By morning, he had what he needed. The Meridian Clean Tech subsidiary had not been created by Kessler Biosynth. It had been created by a shell structure ultimately controlled by Aldercroft, then transferred into Kessler Biosynth's corporate family through a series of transactions that had been designed. And Walter could see the design as clearly as if someone had drawn him a diagram, to look like Yvonne's own financial maneuvering. The inflated valuations had come from Aldercroft's own team. The emails in the prosecution's evidence file had metadata inconsistencies that no one had flagged, because no one had looked closely enough, because Yvonne's own legal team had, it seemed, been specifically chosen for their disinclination to look. He called Yvonne at 6:15 in the morning. She answered on the first ring. He understood, without her having to say it, that she hadn't slept either. "I need you to get me access to your original server logs from the Meridian integration period," he said, "and I need the name of your IT director from that time." There was a brief silence. "Her name is Parveen," Yvonne said. "She still works for me. I'll call her now." "One more thing," Walter said. He hesitated, which was not something he did often. "The car that followed you from the Glebe on Monday night. Did you report that to anyone?" Another silence, longer this time. "How did you know about that, At?" "You mentioned it to your assistant in an email that's in the case file. You wrote it off as paranoia." He paused. "It wasn't paranoia." "Walter." "Yes. Who are you?" He considered the question. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was going pale at the edges, the particular thin gray of an Ottawa dawn in late November. The kind of morning Maureen had always loved. She had called them cathedral mornings, which had seemed strange to him until she explained. "Everything's so still, it feels like someone built a roof over the world." "I'm your lawyer," he said. "That's all you need right now." The courtroom, 2 days later, was more crowded than it had been at the opening. Word had moved through the legal community with the quiet speed of things that are too interesting to stay quiet. A courthouse custodian with a reinstated bar membership, defending a tech billionaire against an Aldercroft-adjacent fraud case. The journalists had found better seats. There were more cameras in the corridor. Walter wore the same dark jacket he had worn to Maureen's funeral. It still fit. He had not bought a new suit in 9 years and saw no reason to start now. He called 3 witnesses. The first was Parveen. Her full name was Parveen Dhaliwal, and she had worked in IT infrastructure for Kessler Biosynth for 7 years, and had the kind of precise, unflappable memory for technical detail that makes an excellent witness and a formidable opponent in any data dispute. She walked the court through the server logs with the calm authority of someone explaining something obvious to people who should already know it. The Meridian data had been pushed to Kessler Biosynth's systems from an external IP address. The timestamp predated any involvement by Yvonne or her team by 11 days. Forsyth's cross-examination was sharp but unsuccessful. He had not had access to the server logs before this morning. His team had clearly not anticipated that anyone would obtain them. The second witness was a forensic document analyst from the University of Toronto, who had, at Walter's request, examined the email metadata overnight. She was direct and methodical, and she used words like timestamp anomaly and header injection in a tone that made them sound as obvious and damning as they were. The third witness Walter called was himself, not as a witness in the traditional sense. He approached the bench with a document he had filed that morning, a formal request to enter additional evidence, and he laid out, in the precise and unhurried manner of a man who has done this many times before and has learned that clarity is more persuasive than theater, exactly how the Meridian Clean Tech subsidiary had been constructed, transferred, and weaponized. He named the numbered company. He named the dissolved Calgary law firm. He named Tilson. He set down a printed record of Aldercroft Energy Group's share price movement in the weeks following Yvonne's public refusal of their acquisition offer. He noted, for the court's consideration, that the fraud allegations had been filed by a firm with documented financial ties to 2 Aldercroft board members. Forsyth objected several times. The judge overruled him each time, in the tone of a man who has grown steadily less patient over the course of 2 days. Walter sat down. The room was very quiet. The verdict came on the 3rd day. Not guilty on all counts. Yvonne received it with the same stillness with which she had first sat at that defense table. But something in her face had shifted, a tension that had lived around her eyes, that Walter had come to recognize as the expression of a person who has spent months bracing against something, had finally released. She looked for a moment simply like a person in a room. She turned and extended her hand to him. They shook, which somehow felt right, more right than a hug would have, more honest than tears. "Thank you," she said. Walter nodded. There were things he could have said. He didn't say any of them. Outside the courthouse, on the broad steps above Elgin Street, with the cameras and the questions and the gray November sky pressing down over all of it, a journalist pushed a microphone toward him and asked what he planned to do next. He thought about the mop in the supply closet near the back entrance. He thought about the crack in the passenger side mirror he kept meaning to fix. He thought about Lily, who had left a sticky note on his coffee mug that morning that read, in her compressed, sideways handwriting, "Go get him, old man." He thought about Maureen. He thought about what she would have said standing on these steps in this cold. She would have laughed, probably. She would have found the whole thing exactly as improbable as it was. "Cathedral morning," she would have said. "Look at that sky." He took a breath of cold air. "I'm going to practice law," he said. "That's what I'm going to do." What happened in the weeks that followed moved faster than Walter had expected, though perhaps it shouldn't have. The society reinstated him without ceremony, which was how he preferred things. 2 of his former colleagues reached out. Carefully, as people do when they are not sure whether they are welcome, he replied to both of them, which surprised him a little. The RCMP opened an investigation into Aldercroft Energy Group's conduct in connection with the Meridian structure and 2 other transactions that Walter had identified in his night at the kitchen table. Tilson, the former Aldercroft counsel, voluntarily presented himself for questioning. The Aldercroft board issued a statement expressing full confidence in their legal compliance, which is the kind of statement that tends to age poorly. Hargrove, the lead counsel who had withdrawn the morning of the trial, was the subject of a law society complaint filed by 3 separate parties. Walter was not one of them. He had considered it and decided it was not his business. Other people's integrity, or the absence of it, was not something he had the energy to manage. What he did have energy for was the office. It was Yvonne's idea, initially. She had come to him 6 weeks after the verdict, in the coffee shop near the courthouse where he had taken to having lunch on his days off, and she had laid out the proposal with the directness he had come to expect from her. A not-for-profit legal clinic, funded by Kessler Biosynth's charitable arm, focused on individuals and small organizations facing corporate legal pressure without the resources to fight back. She wanted to call it the Pruitt Kessler Center for Access to Justice, and she had already identified a space on Metcalf Street, and she had spoken to 2 junior associates who were interested in joining. Walter had looked at his coffee for a long moment. "You'd have to call it something else," he said. "Why?" "Because nobody should name a legal clinic after the custodian." He paused. "It undermines the branding." Yvonne had looked at him with an expression he had seen once before, on the morning he had walked to the bar in his gray coveralls, something between assessment and something else. "It doesn't undermine anything," she said. "It's the whole point." He had been quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the street, at the ordinary Ottawa afternoon passing by. A woman walking a dog, a delivery truck double-parked, 2 teenagers eating something from a paper bag on a bench. He thought about the cases he had walked past, over 11 years of pushing a mop through those marble corridors. The people he had watched lose things they couldn't afford to lose, against opponents who had more money for lawyers than those people would see in a decade. He had watched it the way you watch weather through a window. Distant. Uninvested. He hadn't been uninvested. He had just been absent. "All right," he said. "But the custodians get full benefits and a pension contribution from day 1. Non-negotiable." Yvonne's expression shifted into something that might, from certain angles, have looked like the beginning of a smile. "Done," she said. The clinic opened on a Wednesday in January, in a light-filled space on Metcalf Street with second-hand bookshelves, and a good coffee maker, and a small brass plate by the door that read Justice Unscheduled. A name that had been Lily's suggestion, offered one evening from beneath her enormous headphones, without looking up from her homework, with the casual certainty of someone who understands things intuitively and sees no need to make a production of it. Walter unlocked the door on the first morning. He stood for a moment in the empty room. There was a window that faced east, and the sky outside it was doing something remarkable, that particular winter blue that appears for about 20 minutes in an Ottawa morning before the cold flattens it back into gray, clear and enormous and absolutely still. He thought of Maureen. He thought, cathedral morning. Then he turned on the lights, made a pot of coffee, and waited for whoever needed him to walk through the door. The crack in the passenger side mirror, it should be noted, he finally got fixed that Saturday. Lily came with him to the shop and they ate breakfast at the diner next door, and she talked the whole time, actually talked, in full sentences, about her school and her friends, and a documentary she wanted him to watch about underwater geology. And he listened with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things he did not want to miss. He had missed enough.